My son and his wife laughed while I rinsed their plates. I walked out that night. 2 weeks later, I sold the house, and 3 days before the new owners took possession, I walked back in, sat at the head of the table, and watched them carry their life onto the lawn. They finally knew what it felt like to be under the roof they treated like a rental. If you've ever been taken for granted, hit like and subscribe. This one's for the quiet people who decide quietly they're done. Tell me in the comments, what's one life lesson you wish someone had told you sooner? I read them all. I used to call it my home. You know the feeling. The key in your hand, the porch light you always left on, the smell of something cooking that meant someone would be coming home to a warm plate. I paid the mortgage. I painted these walls. I planted the hydrangeas under the kitchen window. I watched my son, Brian, grow from a sticky-kneed kid who left his sneakers by the door into a man who never looked up from his phone long enough to notice the family picture crooked on the mantel. There was no single dramatic betrayal at first. It was a million small things, paper cuts of treatment that bleed out over time. They moved in temporarily, he said. Until I'm on my feet, he said. And for a while I believed it. Because what else do you do when your child needs you? You open the door, you cook, you clean, you keep the house from unraveling. You put your own plans on hold because someone needs the roof and the chair at the table. But somewhere in the steady rhythm of keeping things running, they started seeing me as part of the furniture. A fixture. A person whose job it was to make their lives smooth. Short beat, useful, replaceable, not family. The night it snapped into place was small and stupid and huge all at once. They invited friends, 2 bottles of wine, 3 takeout boxes, loud laughter that seemed to take up the whole room. I cooked for hours, rosemary, lemon, the whole careful ritual. I polished the wine glasses until the candlelight caught on the rim. I set the table the way I'd taught him when he was 7 and insisted every plate be lined up like soldiers. They sat in the dining room, voices quick, jokes turning sharp and intimate in the way people are when they are comfortable in a place they call their own. I stayed in the kitchen. I served. I refilled. I laughed politely when I was acknowledged mildly between bites. And when they were done, I cleared the plates. They stayed at the table, leaning back, elbows on the back of the chairs, smiling, toasting whatever included them, work promotions, weekend trips, some inside joke I couldn't hear. I moved silently through that ritual. Scrape, rinse, stack. I ate what they left, and my son, my child, sat there with his friends and laughed at something Ashley said, something cruel and low. They made themselves at home in every sense but one. They never looked at me as home. That was the night I finally noticed the pattern for what it was. Not a temporary arrangement. Not a help-wanted situation gone wrong. A slow erasure of me from the life I'd built. I went to bed that night and couldn't sleep. Not because of the noise, but because of the quiet I felt inside my bones. I knew then that leaving wouldn't be dramatic. It would be quiet. And quiet was exactly what they would miss the most. The next morning I got up early, like always. Coffee on, eggs cracking. Routine, the thing that makes the world predictable. Ashley slid into the kitchen with her phone on record, spooning almond milk into a glass without a hello. "Just setting my intentions, guys," she chirped, voice bright and perform-ready. She never looked at me. I put the spatula down. I made my coffee. I watched her walk out as if I were invisible. And something inside me unclenched. Not a big shout. Not a tearful speech. A decision. A quiet, cold, logical choice. If they had decided I was a person they could do without, I would stop being the person they took for granted. I didn't tell them. I packed a small suitcase. A few clothes. My favorite mug. The photograph of Brian with 2 missing front teeth at the beach. The one that made him grin like he'd swallowed the sun. That picture comes with you when you leave a house you built. Not for nostalgia. For proof. Proof that you were there. I stayed in a cheap motel at the edge of town that first night. Scratchy blanket. TV bolted too high. The air conditioner had a rattle that sounded like a distant train. I sat on the bed and scrolled through the photos on my phone. Birthdays, graduations, every casserole and patched knee. I had done the domestic labor of 1,000 invisible tasks. And in return, I'd received a life-sized version of thanks later, which, when you really strip it down, is no thanks at all. But while I sat there, something practical rose up. The house was still in my name. The mortgage was paid by me for years. They had never bothered to put anything in writing. They assumed. They assumed things because they were convenient. They never asked. That small, practical detail stuck in my mind like a flint. I started checking things quietly. Bank statements. The title search. The refinance history. No signatures in their favor. The more I looked, the clearer the path became. They had built their lives inside my roof like tenants who'd never thought to pay the landlord. And landlords can sell their property. I made 3 calls the next day. A lawyer, a realtor, a storage place for the few boxes I couldn't bear to part with. I didn't tell Brian. I didn't tell Ashley. I told no one. Because secrecy is part of power. When people assume you will always stay, that assumption becomes their weakness. You know what it is to suddenly learn you have legal leverage? It's unexpectedly clean. There was no drama in the lawyer's voice, only a steady competence. Yes, you own title, she said. There are no deeds showing transfer. You can sell if you wish. She explained timelines, the way closings work, how notices are posted. It was a map, a plan. I didn't want to humiliate them for the sake of shame. I wanted them to know, viscerally, what it feels like to be the person under the roof they treated like a prop. I wanted them to experience absence, not just the inconvenience, but the sense of being unmoored. They'd been floating through their lives as if someone else did the anchors. It was time to cut the ropes. I met with the realtor who did not say more than she needed to. She was a brisk woman who wore sensible shoes and smelled faintly of citrus and paperwork. We toured the house together one afternoon while Brian and Ashley were still at work. Every room I walked felt both familiar and strange. The sun on the porch. The dent in the banister where Brian slid as a kid. The scuff on the floor where the dog once chased his tail. I took it all in, like a person reading the last chapter of a book they had written. We listed at a strong price, enough to ensure a quick and clean sale to buyers who'd appreciate the home, not someone looking to flip. I told the realtor exactly what I wanted. A short closing window with a typical seller possession period, standard practice in our area, so I could arrange things precisely. We structured it so closing would happen in 3 weeks. Here's the legal wrinkle people don't always think about. Until closing, sellers retain legal possession unless they sign a possession agreement. That meant I could, if I chose, still come and go until the keys passed hands. I told myself that the right time to strike would be just before possession, the gap between signed papers and new ownership. It would be the last place they expected to find me. The last place anyone would expect the owner to be. Sometimes revenge is simple. It doesn't need fireworks. It needs timing. Over the next 10 days, I did the quiet, almost clinical work of preparing. I canceled no utilities because they were still in my name. I didn't stage the house for buyers because I didn't care to flatter them. Instead, I made a list, change locks at the appointed time, schedule movers to be on call, arrange for the professional cleaning to come on the morning of the possession day, and have them surprised by an empty house. No, by something else. I coordinated with the buyer's agent about the window and, most importantly, I asked for one small courtesy. Let me keep access to the house up until the buyer's possession date. The buyers, an earnest young couple with a toddler who had written a letter about wanting space for their child, agreed. They wanted the place to feel honored, not ransacked. They didn't know the full extent of how I would use that courtesy. I did one more thing. I took photographs. I boxed up my sentimental things into the storage unit I rented under my name. Only the photo of Brian as a lad with the lopsided tie came with me in my purse. I put the rest in a clean cardboard box labeled Keep. I had to be pragmatic. There was no room for theatrics that could be called petty. If this was a chess match, I was playing to mate, not to gloat. They noticed my absence on day 3. At 8:13 a.m., a text arrived on my phone, terse and casual. Hey, Mom, you okay? Haven't seen you around. Not, are you okay? Not, we miss you. A civic check. A scheduled ping. I stared at the screen and smiled quietly. I didn't reply. By the 1-week mark, their messages shifted tone. We really need you back, Ashley typed from accounts balanced like a script. The kitchen is a mess. Please, Cheryl. The entitlement in that line made me laugh, sharp and thin. They had owed me an answer my entire life, and now they wanted instructions on how to care for their own mess. I sat in a library alcove, the kind with the fat lamp and the musty books, and I put dates on a timeline. Utility due dates, lease terms, the lender's calendar. I filed the listing disclosure and signed the sale. We accepted an offer exactly as planned. The buyer's family, Marcus and Ruby, were so earnest in their appreciation I almost told them everything. They told me they couldn't wait to hang a swing in the backyard for their little girl. They asked where the good soil was for tomatoes. I told them, and I lied about little nothings I'd never felt I had the right to refuse before. Where to drill for a lamp? The thermostat's quirks, the best plumber. Meanwhile, the house began to fray without me around to tidy the edges. Little things pile up fast when no one notices. A sink full of cups, dog hair under the couch, a jar of peanut butter tucked behind the cereal boxes. People make it look seamless when someone else makes it seamless for them. Take that seam away, and the cloth comes apart. The first real panic text, Brian. We are not in good shape, Mom. You have to come back. Please. I didn't reply immediately. I wanted the call to build in their chests like an ache. I wanted them to feel the slack they'd taken for granted. Instead, I arranged the calendar. Closing date, Friday. Possession, Monday. It gave them the weekend to panic. Perfect. On the day I decided to move back in, 3 days before the buyers would take possession, I drove up to the house just as the late afternoon light softened the paint on the siding. The realtor had left a key in a lockbox under her supervision. Legally, I was still the owner. That small, cold fact felt better than any speech. I unlocked the door. The house smelled like takeout and too much air freshener. A stack of mail sat in the hallway like a monument to forgetting. I walked through each room slowly, not to mourn, but to collect. I opened drawers that had once been mine. I straightened a photograph of Brian that someone had leaned against a shelf. I sat in the dining room and rested my palms on the old table, the wood warm from the sun, and for the first time in months, I placed myself where I had always been expected not to sit. I didn't change the locks. Not yet. I did something smarter. I called the locksmith and had him place a new key set to the main door, but he left the old lock where it was intact. The locksmith looked like he had better things to do. Why the duplicate? He asked. I said, I'll pick it up in a few days. He shrugged. He didn't ask questions. No one did. Then I called the cleaning crew and told them not to come that morning. The message was crisp. We're postponing the clean until Tuesday. They asked why. I said, personal reasons. They didn't press. That night, I slept in the spare room for the first time in months. Not because I wanted to. It was a power move, small but precise. I lay there listening to the house breathe, the same house that had held me while I grew legless and worried. I felt oddly fortified. The plan had a theatrical moment coming, but my heart stayed quiet. I wanted the moment to sting them in the only way that would make the lesson real, seeing me where they would have preferred me not to be. In their dining room, at their table. Content, not angry. Calm. Early Saturday morning, I made an appointment with a caterer, not for food, but for presents. I scheduled a family gathering, one final event where their friends would be around. I called a couple of neighbors I liked and asked them to come by for coffee. Nothing strange, just drinks. I wasn't hiding the plan from everyone. I wanted witnesses. I wanted the people who had seen me do the invisible labor for the years to see the visible restoration before the new owners arrived. Word spreads fast when you do something quiet and correct. Ashley showed up at the house that afternoon. Early, lipstick perfect, hair in loose curls, the posture of someone who thinks they own both the space and the script. Brian followed 5 minutes later, carrying a bag of groceries like a man making amends. He opened the door and froze. He saw me at the head of the table. There are moments in life when a face registers a truth so sharp it looks like pain. Brian's face did that. Not at first anger, but recognition, like someone who watched a movie with closed captions and suddenly realized they'd been reading the wrong lines. "It's... Mom?" His voice tried to make the name small. He wanted to shrink it back into the domestic role they'd given me. He wanted me to laugh and say I was joking. But there I was, cup of tea in hand, plate in front of me, the place set perfectly like every other night I'd set it for them. I looked up, slow and easy, and said, "I didn't come to argue." Ashley, practiced at confrontation, tried to seize the moment. "You can't just," she began, and the words fell out like a script she'd rehearsed. "You can't just barricade yourself in our house and make this public." I smiled the way you smile at someone who doesn't know the truth. "I own it," I said. "Beat. Until Monday, legally. And I plan to dine here until the new owners take possession." Her face changed. The shades went out from her voice. You could see her brain try to recategorize me from background to threat. The friends in the room shifted uncomfortably. People hate uncertainty more than confrontation. When the person who does everything goes quiet, the world suddenly looks wobbly. "Why are you doing this?" Brian asked, small and angry now. Shame had grown a nose and it was breathing in the room. I set my cup down, felt the porcelain hum under my fingers. "I want you to know what it feels like to have someone hold your house and not hold you," I said. Short beat. "I want you to experience the inconvenience of having to do what I did for years." It landed like a stone. I had arranged for movers to be on standby, just in case. I had also arranged for a modest, respectable staging of the house once I left. A few plants, some fresh linens, the fluffed pillows buyers like to see. The point wasn't to take their stuff. It was to remove the illusion that they could continue acting like owners without eyes on the ledger. That Sunday evening, they hosted a little friends and family thing, ostensibly a goodbye brunch for a neighbor moving away. The house filled with voices that had used me as a backdrop for years. I sat at the head of the table, not triumphant but steady. I ate slowly, deliberately, savoring the bread and the quiet. I let them look. I let them squirm. At some point, a streaming video started. Ashley doing what she did best, the perfect smile angled just so, narrating her life as a practiced influence. She began a live story from her living room, talking about how to throw the perfect at-home brunch and panning the camera like someone showing off a stage they had inherited. The window behind her framed me, small and ordinary, as I sipped my tea. Beat, long. People noticed. The live viewers noticed. Comments popped up like insects. Is that her mother? Why is her mom at the table? A few of them knew. A few of them didn't. But the curve of the conversation changed. The online world and the real one converged on that kitchen and dining room. At 3 p.m., the real estate agent texted me. "The buyers are on their way to do a final walkthrough. Closing proceeds per schedule. How would you like to coordinate?" I typed back, "Please do come through. I'm still here. Bring them in. It was surgical." It was public. It was quiet. It was also impossibly elegant in its smallness. When the buyers, Marcus and Ruby, stepped through the front door, they were young and exhausted from moving their toddler between 2 childcare schedules. They walked in like most people do when they first come to a home they hope to love. They smiled with that soft kind of awe at the light and the shape of the kitchen. They started their tour, polite and professional, when Ashley realized what was happening. Ashley, who had for months used the house as a backdrop for her photos, now had to host the new owners on camera. The tone of her voice shifted from blithe to brittle. She explained things about the thermostat a little too loudly. Brian paced. The friends shifted their wine glasses, suddenly full of noises that don't mean anything when someone else is at the head of the table. I stood up and walked slowly to the pantry. I made extra tea. I cut a fresh loaf of bread and set it on the board. Simple domestic moves, yes, but intentional. The ordinary things I'd done to invisibly hold their lives, now they were watching me do them again, and this time it wasn't for them. The buyers thanked me. They asked if I remembered where the water shutoff was. They complimented the garden. Ruby's toddler toddled to the side and pointed at something and laughed. Marcus smiled. There was an ease between them I half envied and half admired. They didn't come to gloat. They came to be welcome, and then, because human beings love a story with a twist, someone who had seen Ashley's live stream flagged the little broadcast and tagged the buyer's agency. Within an hour, half the neighborhood had heard about the woman who was living her last days in a house she sold. The open house that was never meant to be turned into a spectacle suddenly attracted attention. Not paparazzi, not journalists, just neighbors, people she used to nod to at the mailbox, a neighbor who knew how many casseroles my car could carry, a woman who had often seen me sweeping the porch. They came with cold hands and warm faces. Brian lost his composure at that point. He realized the world now had a different lens on them. He'd always been comfortable in obscurity. Suddenly, obscurity was gone. He demanded I leave. He raised his voice so the neighbor's conversation stopped mid-sentence. You can't just, this is our house, he said, voice raw. I took my seat again. I lifted my teacup. I looked at him and said, very soft, you don't lose your house because I am cruel. You lose it because you treated the person running it like she was disposable. Ashley started filming again, phone held up like a shield. She wanted to control the narrative, but control slipped through her fingers like a loop of string. The viewers in the live comments weren't buying her polished outrage. They were seeing a woman, small, steady, who'd simply walked the steps back to the place she built. Then the movers arrived. Not to throw them out into the street. Not to be cruel. But with polite boxes and uniformed men who had paperwork and timelines because the sale was legal. They had a manifest of items scheduled to be removed should the seller vacate. The team leader called me over confidentially and said, we can start a few small items if you'd like. He didn't judge. He understood the choreography. I walked to the front door and opened it, letting the afternoon light wash the floor. I stood in the threshold while the men carried a box of knickknacks onto the lawn. They didn't rush. They were businesslike, not malicious. The near silence was the payoff. The sight of their life, trash bags tied, a lamp here, a stack of framed prints, being moved onto the grass was the lesson. Ashley screamed. It was the kind of sound you make when the illusion you camped inside collapses. She filmed it. Of course she filmed it. And her voice trembled with a rage that had always been performative until that moment. You can't do this, Mom. This is humiliation. She reached for a plate on the table, flung it into the sink, and it rattled like a bell of bad luck. I didn't move. I listened to the dish shatter. I listened to the neighbor's forks fall still. I looked down at the photograph of Brian with the missing teeth in my purse and felt a thing like a closing door inside me. Not regret, not triumph, a quiet comprehension. The weight of life isn't in the stuff you own. It's in whether people will stand up for you. As the movers rolled the last box toward the street and the buyers negotiated the time for pickup, people whispered. Marcus, the buyer, came back across the threshold and paused. He looked at Ashley and then at me, then back at the boxes on the lawn. He shook his head with a small, sympathetic look, which did not excuse what had happened, but made the whole tableau somehow human. The buyers did what people with good intentions do. They checked on the foundation. They asked if there were matters of comfort they should be aware of, and I told them, calm and honest, about the thermostat quirk, about the gutter by the garage that sprays a line on wet days. They nodded. They listened. They thanked me. And then they asked me gently if I had somewhere to go. I looked at them. I could have told them everything. The years of giving, the months of erasure, the way my son had laughed with Ashley the night I swept their plates. I did not. Instead, I said, I have plans. And you will be good owners. They smiled the kind of smile that is both relief and apology. Maybe they sensed the story wasn't theirs to judge. That night, the house felt different. Not because the boxes were on the lawn, but because the air inside was lighter, charged, cleared. The people who had once taken for granted the person who kept the house suddenly had to reckon with the consequences. The purchasers were sensible, good people. They came in like caretakers, not conquerors. They asked if I wanted to show the kids where to swing. They left me with a note. "Thank you for keeping it so cozy." The phrase warmed me in the oddest way. After all my invisible labor, a stranger had seen the work and said it aloud. As for Brian and Ashley, well, life has a way of teaching lessons that aren't always novels. Their phone calls turned frantic for a day, then sharp, then desperate. "Mom, please." Brian's voice broke in a voicemail that felt like someone kneading grief until it was pliable. I didn't call back right away. Part of me wanted them to feel what I had felt. The waiting, the empty chairs, the realization that someone no longer stood in the gap. Another part of me was tired, profoundly so. You learn the difference between righteous anger and the cost of wearing it like armor. Vindication felt hollow if it took all your warmth with it. The kitchen I had loved for decades closed its doors that week as the buyers completed the final paperwork. I let the new owners take the table and the mantel photos and the little dent on the banister. Some things needed to be let go of for the new life I intended to build. I signed the closing papers in a small office, the ink cold on the final line. It was legal. It was clean. It felt like an exhale. Then I did something no one expected. The buyers called and asked if I wanted to perform a simple closing gesture. They offered me the chance to stay in the house for a few hours on the Sunday before possession to show the children where to hang their first art. Beat. I accepted. They thought it was kindly. I knew it was the perfect last scene. On the Sunday, I walked back in with a small box of presents for the little girl, her favorite color, and a jar of seeds. I sat at the head of the table once more, not to gloat, but to be visible, to show up like someone who mattered. I made a pot of tea, told a story about how Brian used to draw fish with 5 tails, and then I watched them, the people who had been comfortable in their taking, listen. They heard me as an actual person, not a background prop, not a keepsake. A human being with authority, dignity, and a quiet joy. That last afternoon was not a dramatic scene of blood and thunder. There were apologies, awkward, halting, human. Brian's were small and scattered across several days. Ashley's never fully arrived. She apologized more to viewers online than to me, which is telling in its own way. But apologies were not what I had wanted. I had wanted change. I had wanted them to feel the consequence of minimizing another human life. They had felt it. Soft beat. The sale closed. I moved into a small apartment not far from town. 2 rooms, a balcony that caught the sunrise, and a tiny hummingbird feeder outside the window. I bought a table the size I liked, just big enough for 2. I cook for myself now, ceremonially. I buy fresh basil and sliced tomatoes and sit and eat while the sunlight lights the rims of the bowls. I write. I sleep. I do not spend my nights pretending silence is a blessing. People ask me if I felt guilty. If I regret it. If I miss the son who once made me pancakes with too much syrup. I miss the past like one misses a song on the radio you used to dance to. Tender memory, yes, but I do not miss the shape of how he became. My choice wasn't a crime. It was a boundary. It was a law of survival written in ink instead of patience. There is a line that some people can't see until someone else crosses it. For my son and his wife, the line was my suitcase on the sidewalk, the silence in the house. For me, the line was the moment I decided my life would not be lived as an unpaid duty. Short beat. That decision wasn't vengeance in the gutter-screaming sense. It was a reclamation. It was, in 1,000 tiny, practical ways, the only revenge that makes sense. Living your life with the dignity they refuse to grant you. We tell ourselves revenge destroys the revenant, that it turns you bitter. But the truth is more complicated. The most dangerous thing is not revenge. The most dangerous thing is accepting the shrinkage of your life to meet someone else's comfort. The most radical act is to stop shrinking. That night on the porch of my new place, with a cup of tea in hand and a rosemary plant that I've named by the calendar, I whispered to the dark, I am home. Not the house, me. The woman who no longer cooks to be seen. The woman who no longer waits for permission to take the seat she paid for. If you stayed with me through this, thank you. If you've been the person who cleans while the people you love laugh in another room, this is for you. You don't owe them anything that costs your peace. You may not see them change, but sometimes boundaries aren't bridges you build for others. They're bridges you construct to get back to yourself. If this story resonated, hit like, subscribe, and share it with someone who needs the permission to choose themselves. Tell me in the comments, if you had one piece of advice to give someone being taken for granted, what would it be? I'll pin my favorite reply. I'll leave you with this. You get to choose your seat at the table. If no one offers, make your own.